this time. Okay. We got some indication that it's recording. Yes, we're recording. Okay. Shall I just say who we are?
Okay. I want to try the hello thing that you do.
Okay, just go ahead. Please do.
Okay. So, hello, dear participants, and welcome to our third interactive webinar. I'm Hanaa Khamis, logging from Cairo, Egypt. I got with me Mr. Van Stevens, who's kindly hosting us in his. He is now logging from Malaysia. Despite his very busy schedule, he's doing a plenary. Is it already done or
no, tomorrow?
Up, Vance?
Tomorrow, 10:30 in the morning.
So it's
I'm ready for
up.
it. Yeah.
Plenary. Oh, I'm glad you are, and it's a very late hour. It's this. I also have our guest speaker, Csilla Jaray. Okay, Csilla Jaray-Benn from France, Grenoble. Is that the way you pronounce it in French? Okay, she's in Grenoble. We met in France before in Paris, right? If you remember, a couple of years ago. Jaray-Benn was France TESOL former president. I think it was 2016 to 2017. Today is Thursday, June 27th, 2019. We're officially opening our interactive webinar. I would like to hand the microphone to Csilla to give us like a 1-minute intro before we start our questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Hanaa, for inviting me, and thank you, Vincent, for hosting and being the techie wizard behind this global event. I'm absolutely amazed that we can put together a professional development event for teachers between Malaysia, Egypt, and France. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I would like to say hi to everybody interested in the topic of empathy that we will have a discussion about with Hanaa. And just a few words about myself. Yes, I was president of TESOL France, vice president, and before that regional coordinator for 4 years for our local branch, which operates here in. I'm very much dedicated to CPD, continuous professional development of teachers. Myself, I'm an English teacher. I come from Hungary. That's my mother tongue, Hungarian. That's where I did my master's degree in English language and literature with a teaching certificate. And I also got a degree in French. And this is why I live in France. So I'm not here because I married a French man, which is very often the case, but I'm here because I came here for work, for my studies, and then I settled down in this town, which is in the Alps, in the mountains. I've been teaching English for adults. I have a training organization that I founded, and I'm between being a freelance consultant and company owner and manager. So I do everything. I do the teaching, but I also do the administrative work behind it. I also teach at the university, English to different parts of the university, which is mainly ESP. And I also do teacher training. At the university Grenoble. We just finished our. Thank you again for having me with you today.
Or maybe not yet.
Emails, probably because here it comes from Africa.
It is.
So.
Well, okay. I feel it's becoming personal.
We embrace it.
So is that okay?
No, I think it's a good way of empathizing.
So we're all together in this, that heat wave. We will have to be understanding. Let me just shed a bit of light on the session today, the title of which is The Role of Empathy in Successful Language Learning and Teaching. This is part of our series of interactive webinars run by NileTESOL, Professional Development Committee, in collaboration with Learning Technology Interest Group. Csilla, allow me to ask you here, because it seems like a new term coming up in our field of ELT, the whole idea of empathy. Exactly when did it start, or when did we start as teachers hearing that term and trying to include it in our classes?
It's a very good question to start with, and to be honest with you, I can't really give you a date of when empathy as a term entered the world of education, words other one in society. So I think that empathy has become almost a buzzword in the past few years, and I can see it in three different big areas as a very dominant theme, and three reasons behind our interest in empathy. One is related to technology, and since this webinar is also part of the fact that we live in a very interconnected world thanks to technology, connection between people and the way people connect has become a major interest over the past decades. The other area which is probably contributing to this is the social environment, the societal environment that we live in. We live in a globalized world where we meet a lot more differences on a daily basis than we used to. Economic differences, cultural differences, gender differences, and obviously linguistic differences as well. And the third area is economic model, which is based on collaboration, which is based on sharing. There's a theory which says that basically the collaborative collaboration might replace competition in our world. There is a book written by a historian, his name is Jeremy Rifkin, it's called Empathic Civilization, and he really argues that this collaboration, which is made possible by this common trait we all share as human beings, the empathy, is really taking over the economic model. Necessarily has to cater to these trends in society. We have to raise a generation, we have to educate a generation who have the skills to cope with these new ways of existing in the 21st century.
Interesting. When I started reading about empathy and what it's all about and how to apply it to our field, ELT and so on, it struck me, it really reminded me of older methodologies that they called before, like designer methods, those funky methods that they used in the past. There was one called community language learning, together with Suggestipedia, together with physical or total physical response and so on, one of which was that community language learning. Do you see any relationship between community language learning, where students are seated in a circle and they brainstorm ideas and questions, and what you call empathy nowadays?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the idea behind the community language learning is that it's not the language which is important. It's the conversation which is important. And it addresses the learner as a whole person. It's a very holistic approach of learning. And supports. I like very much a quote by Martin Buber. I quote it very often. He says that the only way to learn is by encounters. We only learn through meeting another person. That's the real learning. That's how a child starts his life and basically learns all his basic skills for life from another person. And we do keep this ability of being connected, interested in other people's feelings, in other people's thoughts. And this is what empathy is about. So the collaborative language learning came about to counterbalance all those very anxiety breeding methods, which were the drills, the grammar translation method, saying that it's not the language, it's not the grammar, it's not the vocabulary which is important. What is important is to connect with the other person, to engage in a real conversation. And empathy supports this. If we didn't have the skill of empathy, we will look at it a little bit later in more details what empathy is, and then we will understand probably better that yes, empathy, without empathy we couldn't carry on a conversation.
Well, this is nice, and again it reminded me of the different intelligences. There is that one intelligence called emotional intelligence. I hope you've heard about that. It's like how to train learners on using their emotional intelligence for the purposes of learning. Have you seen any kind of common points here and there in empathy?
Yes, absolutely. You see very clearly the point behind empathy. It's emotional intelligences came by in the 90s, 95, 96, I think, by Daniel Goleman, who addressed and considered emotions and our capacity of recognizing, being aware of our emotions and recognizing and being aware of other people's emotions. This is why they created tests to test emotional intelligence. But this is basically to harness emotions and apply these emotions for performing different tasks. In language learning, these tasks could be listening tasks or problem-solving tasks, but in real life and business life, these are real-life tasks which are supported by our emotional intelligence. And empathy, when this system was established, empathy is part of the system. So when they make emotional intelligence tests, for instance, testing people's empathy skills, and how much somebody is empathetic is part of
Interesting.
the test.
So somebody can be emotionally intelligent, has like a high IQ in emotional intelligence. Do we have emotional intelligence dummies around us?
Excuse me?
Once again, I was talking about somebody can have a very high IQ in emotional intelligence. Do you think there are emotionally dummy or emotional dummies around, dumb people, like with low IQ in emotional intelligence?
Well, we are all different. We are all different. We don't have the same IQ, and we don't have the same EQ for empathy. We are all wired for emotions, but these emotions develop in a certain way based on the context and based on the environment and based on the relationship that we talked about.
Interesting. Let me just go to the chat box here. There are some questions, very interesting questions from the audience here. So,
we have to start from the basics a little bit, and I would say that we cannot teach empathy, but we can enhance, we can develop empathy. Because as I said, born with a certain amount of empathy. There are activities that we can use, and being a language teacher, I think we are in the best position to introduce activities which enhance empathy. Empathy is basically about feeling what the other person feels, understanding the other person's emotions, and taking action, doing something which will help or which will be just in tune with this other person. So if we think about the language classroom, the very basic activities when we focus on another person and we focus our learners to interact and focus not on themselves but on the other student is always about themselves. What did I do during the weekend? Where will I go for summer vacation? What happened in my home last night? And instead of flipping this around and focusing on you, that give them the opportunity, set them up in pair work, in role plays, to focus on somebody else and to imagine the situation that other person was in. So there is an activity, for instance, which is very interesting. When you put three people together, they are sitting on a chair, and one person tells the story, a very basic story, what she did or what they did. The other person listens actively and pays attention. The person who was listening retells the story in first person singular, as if it was his story. The third person is there as an observer to observe if the second story was accurate. So this is empathy between you and me, between humans. Empathy has a big part of empathy is imagination. It's imagining myself in the place of another person, taking perspective, looking at the situation from a different angle. So for this, every role play is a very good activity. If you have a literacy program or a reading program in your classroom, you can ask them to retell the story from the perspective of one of the characters.
This is really inspiring indeed. And I believe people normally relate empathy to literature. more than anything. It's like go and read, certain stories, novels, plays, poems, and so on, and just tweak them one way or another to increase empathy. So do you agree that this is one of the ways to integrate empathy?
Yes, absolutely. Because it will just, first step is awareness raising. We have to raise awareness that we live in a world where it's not just me, myself, and I, but there are other people. Introducing topics which are very different can be a second step after this awareness raising phase. And then we can address gender issues, we can address handicap, we can introduce movies that deal with these issues, and first ask our students' opinion about it, and then step by step creating activities which will bring them closer and closer to that other person until they can really step in the shoes of that fictional or non-fictional character.
Interesting. This is a nice thing to discuss here. Elia Adli is zooming in on class activities. How can you possibly integrate, empathy in a class, okay, of English language, okay? So what type of activities lend themselves? You already mentioned one. So he would like to see more practical ideas for activities.
Role plays. I mentioned role plays. Another activity could be, after watching a movie which shows somebody who is very different, whose life conditions are very different, start a correspondence with this person. I did this in my class and my students loved it. It was an imaginary correspondence, but just write letters to this person. And ask questions. Asking questions is a problem abilities when the student create the questions based on what they have seen.
Very nice. You said fictional and non-fictional. So if we use current events, for example, as a topic, current events, the news, politics, economics, things that happen in the real world, how can we possibly tackle these, fiery issues sometimes, and without them blowing up in our face in class? So we want empathy, but at the same time, we don't want to put our classes or students, and we don't want to jeopardize our English language class, so it becomes a disaster at the end of the day. So how do you see that?
I think here we have to clarify something important about the term of empathy. Very often it's confused with sympathy and compassion. It's different. Sympathy means that I feel what you feel. I feel sorry for you. I can listen to your story. I can listen to somebody who is very ill, and then I just feel sorry for the person, and that's it. The switch and the plus with empathy is that I take action, and before I take action, I look at it from outside. I look at it from a distance. And if we introduce controversial topics, and we have already risen some awareness about empathy, and our students have this skill of being objective and taking this distance and changing perspectives, then I think we won't get into this wound up of total chaos and conflict in a classroom, no matter how controversial the issue is. What do you think?
Well, I'm really, from my perspective, this okay, at these times, what's going on in our arena in Egypt, well, we're actually in dire need of empathy, but apparently it's not really possible. Adults are not fit to talk with each other on such issues that require empathy. Like, for example, it's a debatable, controversial issue that has 2 points of view, maybe more. Well, everyone is right and the rest of the world is wrong. And people lose each other over it. So instead of resolving conflicts, we create conflicts if we happen to raise these issues or questions in class. How do you see that? What can we possibly do if you can suggest some solutions?
Well, I think that we do have a lot of power to change the world. But when we talk about similar events, I'm not sure that we can change these things. We can probably change those people who are in our classes to acquire the skills not to enter in these cycles in their lifetime. But yes, unfortunately, the world today needs more and more empathy and more objective perspective taking, wise decision makers. Who feel, who understand other life. By somebody, he's an activist in California, and they do empathy listening circles. And they have empathy pens when people come, and then they can talk and they listen. So what they practice, it's empathic listening.
Well, glad you mentioned that. I had it on my list. It is active listening, all right, as a skill.
Yes.
And we've had that in our methodologies, that we need to develop that kind of skill, listening, but it's not listening in order to talk, all right? You just listen because you need to listen to the other, okay, carefully. What are like some physical sort of exercises to practice active listening, which will ultimately lead to what you're saying, empathetic listening?
Well, what I mentioned, asking questions, even if in an empathy circle, for instance, people just come and the group members, they just practice their active listening, so they listen. But to train the ears and to train the brain to listen in an active way, the questioning method, I think, is very beneficial. So teach your students to always ask questions in writing. So listen and don't interrupt, but ask questions in your head, because it forces, it's a cognitive skill, asking questions. It helps them think in a divergent way, and it helps them also focus on the content of the listening and on the person that they are listening to. The other listening, when you have to retell the story from your perspective, because then it's a sort of test how actively, how attentively you listen to the person. Another activity is to listen to to a dialogue, and instead of listening to the language, give activities which describe the person, not what he said, but what do you think about the person? Describe the person's feelings, describe the person's emotions. Think this conversation or this little video that we watched.
Okay, are there any like tips how we can use our body language to listen actively more or to empathize more?
Well, empathizing is observing, and observing a whole person is
Just a second. Yeah, it's been taken care of. Technical issue.
so observing a whole person and observing what the person says is also focusing on his body language. Classroom exercise can be, even without language, to stand facing the other person and just observe how the person is dressed, and then close your eyes, and then the other person changes something on her dress or hair or whatever they are wearing, and then the other person has to find out what was changed. These are just really awareness raising activities and building the skill of paying attention, observing somebody, observing the body language. And of course, if you go to a drama class, then you will learn a lot of body language that you can adopt, and movements and gestures that you can adopt to express that, yes, you are listening.
Another question coming from asking, how can empathy change students' behaviors?
A lot. A lot, because let's take as an example a student who has never encountered anybody in a wheelchair, for instance. And there is a beautiful video, you can find it on YouTube. It's called My Shoes, which is about two little boys. And one little boy is very nicely dressed. He's sitting on a bench, and obviously he comes from a good background. And there's another little boy who has probably difficult background, not the same conditions, and his shoes are all in pieces. And then he looks at this other little boy who sits on the bench, and then he starts to scream, "I want to be like you, I want to be like you." And then a lady with a wheelchair arrives and puts this little boy in a wheelchair. It's a big surprise effect. But when students watch a film like this, and then you do this perspective changing approach, imagine that it's you, or write something to this little boy, or write something as if you were this little boy. Next time the student meets somebody in a wheelchair, I'm sure that his behavior will be different.
Interesting. I got this question really. Is empathy about understanding or feeling?
Both. There are different types of empathy and different levels of empathy as well. But basically there are three big parts in it. One is feeling what the other person is feeling, and that's what we call emotional empathy. The other part is understanding the other person, and that's where active listening comes in, and that's where the active listening exercises are very helpful. Then I understand this other person's position. And then the third level is that I take action. I do something. I go and help that little boy who is in the wheelchair. And as teachers, we are probably at this level of empathy, that we feel, we understand what our students' needs are, and then we act accordingly.
Very nice. Well, we've always thought the difference between empathy and sympathy, saying, well, empathy is understanding how the other, how the other is suffering or maybe going through a hard time. But sympathy is feeling for that other, okay, and sort of interacting with their feelings and hard time. You're saying empathy has a mix of both. Okay, I'll take your word for it. But let me ask you a related question here. When I empathize, is it fine if I stay neutral and unmoved about, what the other is going through? Or do I have to be moved and emotionally involved in what they're going through?
Mm-hmm.
That hard time.
Now, the most important part in all this empathy business is that we do something. We use it's a skill, we use this skill to act. So, for instance, in healthcare, doctors, it's a very good example, a profession which couldn't function without empathy. Because they have to see the problem, they have to feel the person, they have to understand scientifically what's going on, and then they have to take action and they have to heal the person. Now, if a doctor feels sympathy and feels so sorry for his patient, and he's not neutral, but he will identify himself with this patient, then he would die with every patient.
Yeah.
So has to say objective. The power of empathy is exactly this distance that I can create between a terrible situation and between myself, who am I? I'm not in this situation, so I'm in this position to help. But I can only help if I keep the distance.
I thought so as well, because so oftentimes I've experienced that on the human level. When I get too much involved with a certain problem a student is going through, it starts to affect me. I take it with me home. And before you know it, you may get depressed, okay, after a while, because you've empathized too much, or sympathized, I believe, rather than empathize. Because with sympathy, too much emotional involvement would be harmful to both.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. It is claimed that to teach empathy, you best start at a very young age. You should start with like preschoolers maybe, or KG students, rather than starting that with teenagers or adults where it's too late. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's never too late, but the earlier the better. It's a little bit like language learning. As we said, we're born with, but we develop it through our connections and through the context that we live in. And we don't have the same chances in life to be so well surrounded and richly connected with loving people around us. But in education, there is a beautiful example, which is almost at the beginning of this interest towards empathy, which is called similar program Seeds of Empathy. It's an educational program which was set up in the 90s in Canada, and by now it's spread out. I think there are 12 countries in the world who follow this program, and it's for kindergarten and very young age children. And the program is about introducing a baby in the classroom. And they introduce the baby in a classroom, and the baby becomes the teacher, because the baby cries, the baby has needs, and it wakens up this empathic skill in children, that, oh, we have to feed the baby, we have to look after the baby. And when they have a mathematical problem, for instance, well, they have to weigh the baby. And at this age, thanks to this program, kids who have grown out of this program, they became socially responsible, very empathetic adults. Teenagers are still in an age when I think they are very open to this approach and to further develop these empathic skills. If we present them global issues, for instance, they start to empathize with that diver who is diving among the plastic bottles. Adults are more set in their ways, so obviously it will be more difficult, but it is possible. And there are circles, active listening circles, empathy circles. These are very similar to the community language learning circles that we talked about at the beginning of this discussion, that these are circles to open up to the other person, to engage in a meaningful conversation, to be interested in other person. And yes, I believe that even adults can further develop their empathic skills.
Nice. Here is a question coming from the audience. Elia Adli is asking, can we count empathy as a psychological issue rather than an educational matter?
Yes. Well, it's both. But empathy has been, over the history of the term, it has been studied from many different disciplines. And it's a psychological structure. It belongs to psychology, but I think there's no education without psychology because we deal with people. So psychology is the science which studies our humanness and our psyche. So I think every teacher educational program should have a few hours of psychology. So empathy is both, but it was born in, and it comes from psychology.
Well, it's well known that all learning theories are based on psychology theories. And definitely, yeah, there is that kind of relationship. We were trained as language teachers to trace back methodologies to origins in psychology. So I guess this is right here. The question here is coming from Azza. She's asking here about now building on students' backgrounds and experiences that they share in the class enhances empathy. But again, how can we employ this when the class has a lot of diversity?
Mm-hmm.
So let me just rephrase it.
No, I understand. I understand, but I'm trying to put myself in this classroom with all these diversities. And what I would do, probably, I would introduce an empathy journal. And every day or every week, students could keep a journal, keep a diary of what they have done at home. And after a month of a diary, I would redistribute the parts to another child, to another person in the classroom. And just as I said with the listening activity, that you have to retell the story of another person as if it was your story, retell the story of this person as if it was you, based on what they have written in this diary. I don't know if
well, it's a good idea.
An idea.
Yeah, it's about what we have in common and what we have different. And this is like my perspective here. I would like to ask you here, do you think it's realistic to really, in today's world, to ask our students here to dwell on what they have in common and ignore or pay less attention to their differences with others, with each other?
It's a very, very good and very profound question. I think we all have something in common, and we have a lot more things in common than differences. Speaking a different language is a big difference. It touches our core identity, and I think that the language classroom is the best place and the best class in a school and in education to promote empathy, because the difference is there. As soon as we teach another language, it's different. So accepting this other language and accepting this difference is already an empathic development activity in itself.
Have you ever taught multicultural classes where you try to apply the concept of empathy and creating activities around that?
Unfortunately not. I don't have any experience in certain differences, religious differences, but it's nothing compared to language school in London, where a language and learning the language can sort of protect the mask a little bit. And I met students who, even despite the fact that their English level was not as good, obviously, as their native language, but they opened up more and they talked more about emotions in a foreign language than in their mother tongue.
Very nice. Something related here. Some people may accuse, teachers who adopt empathy as a concept here and try to apply it in class. They may sort of accuse them of trying to manipulate students' minds and feelings about who they are, their identity, and etc., etc., etc. How would you respond to that kind of accusation here? If you're a teacher believing in, we need to nurture empathy in our learners for a better world.
I wouldn't agree with this, and I would probably, it's not you. Just because you empathize with something, with a problem situation or with a different situation, it's just imagining something to be able to act and empathize to understand.
No.
I don't empathize. It's again, we come back to the same thing. It's not sympathy, and I'm not identifying myself with the problem. I just imagine myself in the situation.
Topics that we can possibly introduce that have empathy embedded. What would you suggest for topics to teach in an English class?
You mentioned multicultural issues. Any multicultural issue is an empathy enhancing material. Global issues, environmental issues, handicap, people with disabilities, inclusive education. Today we gladly we talk about it more and more, and there's more and more practice behind it, including gender issues, anything which is different than what I am, and it very much depends on your local context, because obviously for you it's the differences are not the same as for me living in different parts of the world, and for a woman, for a man, for, you know, we all have different perspectives on the differences.
Here, that brings us to heated topics, okay, and, you know, fiery issues. For example, politics, things like gender issues you mentioned, religion, all right? Mm-hmm. These are areas in certain parts of the world are not open for discussion and debate among people, all right? So what do we do here? Because mind you, there are conflicts based on these, and that what really creates the problem. We don't talk enough about these matters, and that's why because you are different, totally different. So, I mean, how can we strike a balance? How can we sort of like get ourselves to be much more empathetic with each other without clashing with each other?
I think we have to look at it that we learn from each other, and that's where we started, and that's what empathy is a facilitator, basically, for learning, that we learn from differences, and we can try to fix problems, but maybe it's not in our power, but at the end of the day, it will change us. It will bring about some change in ourselves.
Do you agree with me? Activities that have, controversies, debates, argumentative topics and writing, simulations like UN, for example, simulation, and so on and so forth. Can we use these activities and techniques to teach empathy?
Absolutely. Debating activities. The model for the United Nations, which runs in schools, is a very nice framework, because groups of students, they have to represent another country than their own country. So it forces them to study this country and to put themselves in the position of people living in this country. So I can imagine similar debate groups, but debating not for your own views, but for somebody else's views that you adopt as if it was yours. But again, you keep this perspective and distance between you and the activity to stay objective and to be able to come up with a solution and take a smart step forward.
So how do you deal with that in practical terms? What are the rules that you sort of set for the discussion and the conversation or the debate to go on without things going out of hand?
Well, not to be personal. So don't hurt each other. Don't judge. Don't criticize. Stay factual. Probably these would be basic rules that I would set up at the beginning of the activity.
All right, because Vance needs to wrap up our session today because he has to go now. We started like a couple of minutes late. I just dedicate that to a couple more questions here, maybe. One coming from Azza. What if a teacher doesn't really care about students learning more about empathy? What it's all about grades and getting, doing well on exams. So what do we do, I mean, with those teachers?
Well, it's difficult. It links back to the question that you asked, if we can develop empathy in adults. There are teacher training programs, and there are professional development opportunities, probably, where this teacher his own empathic skills, because obviously we our children that we are unable to do ourselves. So yes, it's a difficult situation.
It is. So yeah, I mean, we have to really believe or buy that before we start doing that. So as a matter of fact, I find this topic very relevant to me today, because at this point, it's like sports, ethics, simple acts of whatever, anything that, decisions, simple decisions made by different, entities around the country. I mean, we simply fight over everything. And there's always that, lack of empathy, and it's all about insulting the other. So find little tips here to teach people to be much more civil and increase their spirit of empathy. What would you say?
Look at other people around you, talk with other people around you, ask questions from people around you, and just try to imagine every day for 5 minutes living the life of somebody else, and then come back to your own and live with that, and try to take good actions.
Let me share something very personal with you. I was observing you that day when we had this closing session in France Colloquium, where there were winners of, I think there were poems by writers, and some people were awarded things. I saw a moment. Remember why you teared up?
Well, I'm very thankful that you remember, because that means that you did observe me, you did care about me. Yes, it was a poetry competition, which the person who asked to do it and who gave the money and the awards, because the award was a certain amount of money for the winning poets, he couldn't be there, and he's somebody in the year after, and I just felt so emotional. I missed him so much, and I said, why he's not here to see what effect his initiative had on a whole community of teachers who were here for 3 days together.
Very kind. Yeah. Very kind of you. Do you remember the winners? Where they were from?
Yes, I remember, but I might mix them up because we did it again the next year. So now I have the 6 winners in my head, and I'm not sure which was the first and which was the second.
Roughly speaking, which part of the world did they come from?
Yes, now that you remind me, that was the year that we invited people from Africa. So I know that one of our African guests from Cameroon, she won the first prize, which was very apropos, and it was not agreed on, but this is how it happened.
Yeah, that was so nice. I really liked that gesture that day. Don't want to take more time from you or Vance. I would ask Vance to come forward. We'd like to see you, Vance, please, video and audio. We are signing off, and we would like to thank all our participants today. Let's give the mic to Vance to wrap up.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Always good to have that confirmation. Ever since they invented telephones, people have been asking, "Can you hear me?" So anyway, thank you very much, Hanaa. Hanaa, need to get your pronunciation just right. And this is Learning Together, episode 413. And as Hanaa said, we're the 27th of June, 2019. I always put this information on recordings because it irritates me a little when people don't leave it on the recordings. You don't know when the recordings are coming from. But anyway, this is a podcast series that used to go every Sunday, but I'm less regular now. But Hanaa has come back on with her webinar series and has given us some incentive to bring more content, fresh content into our podcast. So we certainly appreciate that. And as I said, maybe off record, she's a very good interviewer. So she keeps things going.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Vance, for that gesture. And I'm asking here everyone attendees today to type in their emails in the chat box. We would like to just give them a little reward, a badge, an e-badge. So don't forget, please, our dear participants, to type in your email addresses in the chat box. Csilla, would you like to add one last comment?
Well, thank you very much for being here and joining this discussion. For me, it was first time. I did presentations, online presentations, but I never had an interview. So thank you very much, Hanaa, for the invitation and for your help, because you helped a lot. You were very present, preparing it, and you were very supportive and sacrificed 1 hour of their lives for discussing about empathy. And try out some of the very simple activities that we talked about, just helping your students to be aware that there are other people out there and they are different, and we have to care about them.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you for with us. I wish you a good night's sleep before your plenary tomorrow morning. So Vance, you have everything we've had, and I think you need to decide when you're going to switch off the video recording.
Okay, well, still recording, and yes, I'll switch it off now. And of course, it doesn't mean everybody has to go away right away, but I am going to stop it. So all you got to do is find it. Here we go. Stop recording.